This is a production of Cornell University.
Welcome, everyone. I wish it were possible to see you, but from here, it's not easy. We're delighted that you're here, delighted that so many of you would come for this intellectual discussion and for this panel presentation. I'm here really to introduce the faculty and then moderate the discussion. These faculty members who've been invited are representative of 1,600 faculty members at Cornell Ithaca and about the same number at Weill Cornell Medical College. They're also exemplary in a range of different ways. You'll find biographical sketches of each faculty member in your program. I'm not going to review all of that, but I'll just say a few brief words about each person, and apparently they have asked me to encourage them to come on down when I'm done with the individual introductions. First, Professor Fred Logeval. Fred Logeval is professor and director of graduate studies in the Department of History. He specializes in American foreign relations and political history, and he brings to his scholarship an interesting perspective as someone who was born outside of the United States. Fred was born in Stockholm. Fred has written a great deal about the Cold War and the war in Vietnam. He has a piece on Lyndon Johnson and the politics of escalation that will appear shortly. And he's made interesting observations about the why and how of America's involvement in Vietnam and also in Iraq. He is a contributor to a very important student text on U.S. history, and though a relatively recent recruit to Cornell, already a beloved teacher for undergraduate and graduate students. Fred Logeval. Maureen O'Hara is the Robert Purcell Professor of Management in the Johnson School, a professor of finance. Maureen O'Hara, as many of you know, is an expert in market microstructure. She has earned several Best Paper awards, including a NASDAQ award for the best paper on capital formation. She is sought after to give keynote addresses throughout the world. She was the first woman to serve as president of the American Finance Association. She is well known for having said that the question after 1987, with the emergence of technology and the 87 stock market crash, is not how markets are structured, but how they should be structured. And I think we'll hear something on that subject from her this afternoon. Maureen, thank you. Dr. Ralph Nachman is Associate Dean for Clinical Research and the Lewis Thomas University Professor at the Weill Cornell Medical College. A physician and a scientist, as well as an administrator, a mentor, and a teacher, Dr. Nachman was the first to cultivate human endothelial cells, an achievement which opened the floodgates to advances in vascular biology. His contribution is enormous. He spent a decade directing our joint MD-PhD program offered in conjunction with Rockefeller University and Memorial Sloan Kettering. He's currently the director for the Institute for Clinical Research, one of several recent initiatives at Weill Cornell Medical College. And when I asked David Hajar whom I should invite from Weill Cornell Medical School to serve on the panel, he said Ralph Nachman can talk about anything, and I'm sure he will. Ralph Nachman. Dan Huttenlocher is the John and Rilla Nevesey Professor of Computer Science and Business. Dan has been a Chief Technology Officer in Silicon Valley and knows the world of business from the inside out, but he is also a leading computer scientist whose research ranges from visual object recognition to the implications of web-based information networks. He looks at the structure of social networks and how they influence our propensity to take certain kinds of actions. Dan was also the faculty advisor for students on the 2007 DARPA Urban Challenge team. This team made it to the competition finals based on the ability of a car guided by artificial intelligence to navigate city streets without a human driver or even a remote human driver, obeying traffic laws, merging, passing, all without hitting anyone. Now that's the official line, but Dan told me that actually Cornell's car was hit by MIT's, But since neither car was disqualified, it doesn't count. Ishwar Prasad is the Talani Senior Professor of Trade Policy in the Department of Applied Economics and Management in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. Ishwar joined our faculty from the International Monetary Fund, where he was chief of the Financial Studies Division. You may have seen his name recently in the International Herald Tribune, where he wrote an article about the World Bank's findings that the economies of China and India are actually substantially smaller than previously thought. Or you may have read something that Ishwar wrote in Foreign Policy, where he had a major article with co-author Marvin Goodfriend on China's currency crunch. He's recently been invited to contribute a piece to the Financial Times in which he argues, I read it just last night, that India has an opportunity to take leadership in the world economy, and that it could do so on moral grounds that would make it unique. We'll perhaps hear more about that from Ishwar. Susan McCooch is professor of plant breeding and genetics in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. She addresses problems of world hunger through her work in research and also in international agriculture. Susan McCooch and her colleagues produced the first molecular map of the rice genome in 1988. She's known to have said that plant breeding is the perfect marriage between the new biology, genetics and genomics, and the opportunity to have an impact on global food supplies. Her goal is to create maps of genetic material of rice as a resource for other researchers, but also to produce rice as a source of food all over the world. And while some plant breeders use transgenics, Susan McCooch actually does not. She focuses on the integration or the incorporation of traits from wild rice into its domesticated cousins to improve rice varieties for different parts of the world. Peter Katzenstein is the Walter S. Carpenter Jr. Professor of International Studies in the College of Arts and Sciences. He works at the intersection of international relations and comparative politics. Peter is an original thinker and a highly prolific author with a number of books about to appear and several that have been published in the last 2 years. His interests now include how politics influences questions of public diplomacy, law, religion, and popular culture. He provided lively and insightful commentary to a wide audience, including many of you, back in the last fall in a symposium called Culture, Identity, and Conflict in World Affairs, which was held in conjunction with President Skorton's inauguration and featured neoconservative scholar Robert Kagan. Peter Katzenstein, as is the case with Dan Huttenlocher, is a Weiss Fellow, an award-winning teacher, as is Maureen O'Hara, the award-winning teacher in the Johnson School. All of these faculty are known to be outstanding teachers of undergraduates and graduate students. I couldn't be more delighted to have you see and hear from examples of faculty whose research contributions could not be more outstanding, but whose dedication to teaching and to service are equally distinguished. Thank you very much, and here's what we're going to do. We'll proceed actually in the following way. We've had some discussions among ourselves, and we know some of the issues on which we disagree and agree. I'm going to start by asking Dr. Nachman to talk a little bit about what he sees as the urgent challenges from the point of view of the sort of work he does. And that's a question that we will then extend to each one of the panelists. And we have a particular order in mind because their perspectives build on and to some extent correct one another. And then our conversation will be free-flowing until we get to the point of the question and answer period, which gives you an opportunity to ask the panelists to speak about the kinds of things you'd like to hear them discuss. So let's begin.
I've spent my life in biomedical science and teaching and clinical care, and I look at one of the great challenges of the present time as the need to transfer the incredible advances that have been flowing in the last several decades, perhaps 3 to 4 decades, from biomedical science and its impact spectacularly on the individual health of people in this country as well as a good part of the Western world. And the challenge is how to transfer those advances from individuals to the populations at large, and in particular to the third world. I see this in the context of Cornell University and its schools as a global enterprise accomplishing or attempting to accomplish these things in a markedly shrinking world. The challenge is enormous, and the opportunities, I think, are also enormous. I view the transfer of the great advances in health that have come from biomedical science to the third world as a moral imperative for this country and the Western world.
Thank you. One of the most interesting discussions we had when we gathered had to do with the question of what it means to transfer knowledge and what the complexities are in that transfer, what the complexities are in the way we conceptualize that transfer. And Susan McCouch has a slightly different perspective, although very closely related to the kinds of things that Ralph has just articulated as urgent from his point of view. Susan.
So I'm a plant breeder, and I work in the field of rice breeding. So I work primarily in the developing world. And what I see as the opportunity to transfer technology requires that we also, and perhaps fundamentally, understand the cultures that we're trying to work with. All of agriculture has this kind of dialectic built in, and that is that you have to imagine that as a plant breeder, we're working with the cutting edge area of genomics and genetics today, but we have to work with and select on genotypes that are adapted to the environments in which the food will be grown. And those environments aren't only biological environments or ecological environments, they're also cultural and sociological environments. And so I just emphasize the fact that in thinking about what we have ahead of us to improve food production and the sustainability of agriculture globally in the face of changing climate, in the face of population growth, in the face of shrinking supplies of fresh water, we also have to understand the sociology and the cultural constraints of the regions of the world where that food is going to have to be produced if it's going to feed the people who are in most need.
Susan, can you give us an example of an advance that hasn't worked by virtue of a failure to understand the culture or social system?
I think probably most of you are aware of the contention around the Green Revolution, which certainly transferred massively the potential to increase yields of rice and wheat throughout the tropics. But it came at a great cost, and the great cost was that it brought a technology, not just the seeds, but a whole technology with it that required the use of pesticides, massive pesticides, herbicides, and largely more and more mechanized forms of labor. And so I think what we're looking at now is, as we work very closely with some of the cultures in Africa, trying to avoid the excesses of the Green Revolution and yet enhance the potential for the African continent to produce the food that it needs, but not to do so by simply importing technologies that work in other places. The soil properties, the water properties, and the cultural limitations are entirely different.
Thanks. Peter, on the question of culture and whether it matters or any other
well,
question.
this sounds very different from our initial discussion in Biddy's office last week, where Susan ripped into Ralph and said, I can't believe what you're saying. So, and I feel, you know the one about the old rabbi, right? I mean, I think, Ralph, that's true. I think what Susan says, that's true too. And what I'm going to say is true too, okay? So between Mr. Fix-It, which is Ralph's, of course not Ralph's real position, but the position I'd like to assign to him, and Mrs. Complicated, which is Susan's position, you know, you have to figure out what's the world. And you know, on one side I say Mr. Fix-It reminds me of Saul Steinberg's cover for the New Yorker, not the one which you all love, which is New Manhattan as the center of the universe, but the other one, which is Manhattan with docking stations. You know, Britain can dock in, Japan can dock in, and it's the world is flat kind of view of the universe. Well, that would be the world in which time and space are shrinking. I know Dan is going to talk to this. And there's a certain element of truth to that. But in the Katzenstein household, there is a race between me and the postal officer getting the Christmas presents to my sister in Germany. Well, this year's was I airmailed it on December 13th. It was received outside of Berlin on January 8th. So much for globalization. So I feel like the two positions, I feel I'm sitting between two stools. On the one hand, there is American exceptionalism. We are a naive, historically amnesic, technologically obsessed culture and country. And we are analyzed best, I still think, in my field, you know, thinking about the war. The best book written about the war is The Quiet American, written by a non-American in the mid-1950s. That's one view of America. And it's the one which, you know, professors at Ivy League schools talk about all the time. That's one part. But the other part is autobiographical for me. I was born in Germany in 1945. I wouldn't be sitting here without America, not Germans, liberating Germany, together with the Russians, the British, and the French. So there is an alternative life for me out there. You know, I could have been the member of the Academy of Science, the Humboldt Society in Berlin, in the year 2007, organizing the racial relations in the Ukraine. Life has treated me much better because of this other part of America. And these two competing views, I think, are really what Americanization is about. It is a two-way street. It's not a one-way street. It's not transporting us out there. It's also the world kicking back on us. You in New York know that from 9/11. But people in Detroit know this too. There used to be an automobile industry there. Well, it looks very different now. So Americanization as a two-way street is a more complicated world. At the Battle of Copenhagen in 1802, I think, you know, here was Admiral Nelson. He was told to retreat. And Nelson looks to his flag captain and says, you know what, Mosley? I'm blind on one eye. So he put his binocular, his telescope on the blind eye, turned it around, and said, what, Mosley? I can't read the signal. And in the end, of course, Nelson won the battle.
Okay. All right. Dan, are Americans technology obsessed?
Well, I would say there is a certain kind of American technological orientation, but I wouldn't go so far as to say technology obsessed. And in fact, I think there's an interesting example of maybe how we view technology in the United States versus, say, Europeans, and some of us who sit between the European and the American, down at that end of the stage. But so, I mean, as Americans, for example, we tend to not be so fearful for our privacy when it comes to technology compared to Europeans when it comes to what our businesses are doing. So, for example, there's a recent illustration. Google and a number of these companies that have these online mapping services, now Google's one is called Street View. I don't know if you've seen it, but when you look at the online map, they show you a view of the building as it looks from the street. And of course, those pictures are taken by driving around through the cities of the world. And there are pictures of people's faces and the license plates on their cars. And if you were someplace you weren't supposed to be, of course, there you are for everyone to see. And as Americans, we don't seem particularly perturbed by that. But Europeans have very strong privacy laws. And so as these companies are starting to roll these services out in Europe, they have to remove anything that identifies individuals from the data. So all the faces and all the license plates need to be obscured. And so I think technology as a lens can sort of show us something about our society versus other societies when we look at how it's adopted and how it's regulated in different parts of the world. I think there's an interesting thing about the European versus American use of technology that's sort of a flip side, which is that in Europe, the government has much more technology at its disposal to record things about individual citizens than in the United States. And so when you look at how technology is used in Europe, the government uses it a lot to keep track of its citizens compared to in the United States. But the opposite is true with respect to businesses. Europe regulates businesses and doesn't allow them to gather information that might violate privacy. So I think if you use technology as a lens to, say, compare American and European societies, it suggests that Americans trust their businesses and not their government, and Europeans trust their government and not their businesses, which is sort of an interesting reflection. There's, if I may, on one other item for a sec? Sure. See, this is the problem with faculty. Give us a microphone. The other thing I wanted to touch on briefly, in addition to just sort of the American exceptionalism, is the fact that technology is shrinking the world. And maybe as a computer scientist and a technologist, I see this more than everybody else, but I think even when I talk to non-technologists, I hear that from people. And I mean shrinking it in a different way than just sort of the world is flat, which I think many of us have read, which is a very business-focused view of the world of the world being shrunken by technology. But failure to deliver packages in a timely fashion aside, I think one of the things that's happening is that the electronic world that we're all living in more and more is throwing together people from very different cultures and backgrounds and beliefs who used to be separated by space and time. And that both has the opportunity to increase discord and conflict because you're throwing a bunch of people together who disagree, or it has the potential and the opportunity, which I think falls on us as technologists and us as citizens of the world, to actually increase understanding of one another. And I think one thing interesting about Wikipedia, the online encyclopedia, is that it's been tending more towards the latter. If you look there, there's some very interesting dialogue and back and forth between people who fundamentally disagree with each other, but come to some consensus on what should be expressed in Wikipedia. So with that,
So you're an optimist.
I'm always an optimist. So there, I'm definitely an American technologist. We are optimists.
Let's give Fred a chance to,
I just wanted to amplify one point that Dan mentioned.
Go.
This concept of the shrinking world really is astounding in the sense that if you think about how information was transmitted or the time it took for a fact or a piece of information to travel around the planet a few hundred years ago, it was probably 1,000 days. Now it's 1,000 milliseconds. So the log order changes are staggering, and that can be directly related to another issue regarding health and disease. One of the major challenges of the modern world, in addition to the political environment that we're all experiencing at the present time and terrorism, is the emerging new infections, viruses and bacteria, resistance, etc. And because of this shrunken world and the rapid mobility, it doesn't take more than a couple of days for new organisms to travel halfway around or totally around the planet. So, Peter, I think that despite your concept of a two-way street in terms of Americanization, I think there is a great deal of self-interest in our coming to the recognition of what globalization really means. We ignore it at our peril.
It's a good time, given the comparisons to the past, to go to the historian. Fred, you want to weigh in on this?
Well, I want to strenuously object to Dan's. No, I don't actually, but I want to qualify. Well, we were told, of course, to have some disagreements, and it may be that Dan, that in fact Americans, I would say, suggest as the historian on the panel, are technologically obsessed, or at least Americans, and I would say, by the way, that I don't have the sense that this has changed, but that at least historically have gone to the incense shrine of technology and gotten carried away. So the telegraph, for example, The telegraph was going to, of course, make long-distance communications not only a reality, but in the process was going to end ignorance and was going to end discrimination. The railroad was going to collapse physical distances and also unify Americans. Closer to our own day, SDI, or as we fondly call it, Star Wars, was going to shield us, literally, shield us from the attacks of our adversaries. And on some level, this is, I guess I'm, like Peter, I have a mixed evaluation. I find this technological optimism quite admirable. And it certainly is understandable when you consider the extraordinary economic growth of this country over the last, say, 150 years. Not the last 150 days, but let's not go there. But over the last, since the American Civil War, certainly the technological innovation, the economic growth is astounding, and therefore one can understand why generations of Americans have thought, A, that the previous generation doesn't have much to teach them, but also that progress, technology is synonymous with progress, and that progress is a good thing. The problem, however, is that, as I said, we get carried away, and secondly, that there is, as we all know, a price to be paid for this technological optimism. Because that same optimism that put a man on the moon, that put a computer in every home, helped to bring on the Vietnam War, helped bring us into Vietnam, and then after we arrived in Vietnam, kept us there year after bloody year as the casualties, not only on the American side, but obviously on the Vietnamese side, mounted. Peter referred to Graham Greene's classic book. And Greene, of course, warns by talking about Alden Pyle, the title character, about America's naive and dangerous innocence. And that was 10 years before American ground troops entered the war. I think it also helps explain Iraq, something we may talk about tonight, and the fact that the United States is in Iraq and will be in Iraq for a very long time. And again, that technological optimism probably helps to explain why our military expenditures for fiscal 2008 are likely to be on the order of $620 billion. This is more than the rest of the world combined, and it's 10 times more than our closest competitor, the Chinese, roughly 10 times more than the Chinese are spending. So we're still at that incense shrine, even as we speak.
In the context of a discussion of optimism, it seems important to go to an expert in finance. Maureen?
I'm a finance professor who studies the structure and regulation of markets, and certainly it has not been easy to be optimistic this week. I will push on that. I will also stress, however, for those of you concerned, that no one in our finance department, and thankfully no one in Cornell's investment office, has been busy losing $7 billion in stock index futures either. So it's an interesting week for the financial markets, and it's interesting to pick up the themes that I've heard my colleagues talk about, the role of technology, this notion of whether technology is bringing us together or apart, or the costs and benefits. When you're looking at the financial markets, the debate actually is at a slightly different point, right? The technology has linked markets everywhere, right? Because of the great American ingenuity, land banks in Germany can lose tons of money holding subprime mortgages, whereas before they couldn't have. So we've managed to tie together the capital markets in a new and important way. And while I say it facetiously about the way we can spread our risks around, we also have allowed access to capital, which is allowing markets all over the world to flourish. The challenge with capital, and the challenge that faces people like myself who look at the design of markets and think about questions of markets, is how do we balance the tremendous benefits that come out of financial innovation, that come from the ability of technology to transform how we get capital, not just here within the country but around the world, with the tremendous risks that come from financial chaos and the difficulties we've seen this week. And again, as we think about naivety and naive optimism, I'm not entirely sure the U.S. really has the only claim to that. The French bank Société Générale certainly this week was much more optimistic than they should have been about what their traders were up to. So we'll come back, I'm sure, to these technology issues, but certainly where I am, they're fundamental to how we begin to think about going forward in the markets today.
Ishwar Prasad, you surely have a view on this.
Let me try to link up what Maureen said in terms of this concept of financial globalization with references to globalization encompassing not just the industrial countries but a much larger group of countries. And notwithstanding the lack of efficiency of Deutsche Post and US Postal Service, financial globalization is still sweeping the globe. And the torrents of money that are flowing across the world are remarkable by historical standards and even the standards of emerging market countries. And one of the interesting things about the most recent wave of financial globalization is the amount of money flowing from the industrial countries to the emerging markets. But as Maureen pointed out, this has brought with it a very specific set of challenges for these countries, how they manage this process of integration into the world economy. Now, this is where at one level there becomes an important requirement that we start thinking about what it is that our academic knowledge teaches us. And here, unfortunately, the data are hugely uncooperative in terms of lining up with our models. We have many very good theories out there which are absolutely outstanding and beautiful, but it turns out that reality is a little removed from that. But this suggests to me not just that we should be looking at our models more carefully, but that there needs to be a much more active dialogue between the policymakers on one end and on the other end, academics such as ourselves. But in addition, there is a very important group that needs to receive a voice, which is the people on the ground who are ultimately feeling the effects of these forces of globalization. So even policymakers and academics do tend to be at a remove at some level from these people who do feel the brunt of globalization. And ultimately, unless globalization leads to more inclusive growth, you are going to see very large social and political tensions arising, especially in many emerging markets. Now, I used to work in Washington where we always thought it was the center of the universe, and as Peter has pointed out, in Manhattan you have a very different view. But it turns out that even that view may not entirely be the way to go forward. If you think about the relative importance of the emerging market economies, what has happened in the last decade or so, especially in terms of the growth of countries like China and India, really has put them at the center of the world stage. Now, Biddy talked about the recent World Bank data, which have created quite a flutter, because they suggest that if you try to look at a comparison of Chinese and Indian GDP relative to the US GDP, China and India are now 40% smaller than we thought they were. Remarkably enough, people in Beijing and Delhi don't seem to be walking around with glum looks on their faces as though they just lost 40% of their income. But the reality is still that these are very large economies. They have been growing very fast and contributing a great deal to world growth. And that picture really hasn't changed very much. So how one integrates China and India into the world economy is a challenge not just for those economies as they are buffeted by the forces of globalization, but even for the US and other industrial economies. You've probably heard about this massive amount of money that Chinese and Indians now have to invest abroad. This is their accumulation of foreign exchange reserves. Last year, China accumulated almost $250 billion. India about $100 billion. And that's excluding all the other emerging market countries. And they're coming shopping to Manhattan, buying up, as some people refer to it, the crown jewels of America. They're buying up Citibank, they're buying up other important banks. But again, this notion of the crown jewels of America or about American banks is blurring over time because ultimately ownership is getting very dispersed around the world. And this is a theme that I think Americans, in addition to people in other countries, will have to get used to, that the world is becoming a much more level playing field. And although America retains its dominance and is likely to for a while to come, these other countries are going to become much, much more important on the world stage.
Thank you, Ishwara. Now, I saw all of you writing when others were speaking, and so I'm now going to give you an opportunity to take issue with what you heard. Peter?
It's hard to know where to start. So let's start with the notion of that in reality, China is still very big. Although we've just learned from our economist friends, it's 40% smaller than we thought it was. China emerged as a major political power in either 1992 or 1993 when the IMF decided to recalculate the Chinese GDP, which had been $300 billion, and the high estimate was $3 trillion, and the economists settled on $1.5 trillion. It seemed like my grandmother's logic. And that made China, on the top page, front page of the New York Times, a big power. What's interesting is, while there something happened to the definition, China will not decline as a great power because of a mere drop of 40% of the GDP from one month to the next. It will remain a great power. So there's obviously a great difference about how we think about reality. Reality in one time is very fluid and open to the interpretation, and another time it isn't. And why is that? And I think this has a lot to do with the political ground on which the economy functions. I always tell my students political economy is open to two forms of interpretation. One is economic explanations of politics. That's what you hear from people in finance. And the other one is political explanations of the economy. What determines in which property right system, legal system, and political configuration, in which arrangements are these markets embedded? So the largest sovereign wealth fund is not China, it's not yet Saudi Arabia, it's not Russia, it's not India, it's the United Arab Emirates with $800 to $900 billion. Well, the United Arab Emirates is not a major political force in world politics. That sovereign wealth fund is going to have a very different effect from the Saudi sovereign wealth fund, because after all, Saudi Arabia is a country which attacks us and which gives us oil, which makes it very complicated for us, okay? Or the Chinese or the Russian ones. So the fact of globalization always ranges across a political terrain. It's carried by politics. The first era of globalization, when there were the most bestsellers, was between 1900 and 1910. The best-selling book on globalization, published in 1905, predates World War I by 9 years. I don't see much reason for optimism there.
You certainly can. Just jump right in. Yeah.
In fact, I thought Peter might complain at some stage that we economists have this tendency to try to take over other disciplines. We haven't yet tried to take over physics, but we have tried to take over some parts of political explanations of economics, historical explanations of economics, and I think Peter, at one level, has a very important point to make here, which is that trying to think about economics as being distinct from politics or sociology doesn't really make a great deal of sense, because ultimately these issues are embedded within one another. Why we care about China's sovereign wealth fund, and for those of you who are not familiar with the concept, a sovereign wealth fund is basically a mechanism set up by certain countries where they take the amount of wealth that they have and use it through these institutions to invest abroad to get higher returns. China, for instance, holds a lot of its foreign exchange reserves in US government bonds, which don't provide a very high rate of return. And when you have $1.5 trillion US dollars, you start wondering whether you shouldn't be doing a little better in terms of the return. So that's what these sovereign wealth funds are about. But the big concern is about whether sovereign wealth funds could in fact be following not just higher returns, but be used in order to manage political agendas. And this is a very serious concern. Many of the sovereign wealth funds in the Gulf are not very transparent about their operations. As Peter said, perhaps we're less concerned about the UAE than we are about Saudi Arabia. But if China does come in and start buying, again, what are seen as the crown jewels of America, it could lead to a very different reaction from the domestic body politic in the US. And this could affect much broader economic debates. It could raise the trade tensions between US and China to an even bigger plane. So ultimately, these forces do matter for each other. And I take Peter's point completely that trying to view, or at least my interpretation of his point, that trying to view one as isolated from the other is not quite right. But if my interpretation of Peter's point is that the politics is more important than the economics, that I probably would not concede.
Yeah, go ahead, Maureen.
Can I just follow up on and amplify some of the things that Eshwar was saying, that it's been intriguing to me to see the pushback on the idea that, you know, foreign investors will be coming in and investing in Citicorp and Citibank. You know, I think from a finance professor's point of view, the perspective is, thank heaven someone is. You know, when we think about lack of transparency, it's certainly true that these sovereign funds leave something to be desired in terms of knowing transparency, but similarly so too do these large corporations. I think part of the challenge of what does it mean to be an American corporation anymore is how global our corporations are. Moreover, we routinely are buying companies all around the world. I mean, what it means to be American is I think, the key thing that when I look at U.S. business, if we want to think about U.S. business, it's been the ability of U.S. business to become global, to look at the board of directors of what's, quote, an American company, and see not just all native-born Americans or newly citizen Americans, but for American companies to have become global, to have people from all around the world within our corporations. And so when we talk about the, you know, quote, foreign money coming into our corporations, to me, that's a testament to how well we are globalizing and moving forward. And it's the reason why I am indeed on the optimistic side of this argument. So I don't see this political of us versus them. I see us as us and them, and thankfully so.
Ralph? I'd like to talk about an 800-pound political and economic gorilla, which is in the room, which is part of, I think, what we're talking about, and that is the healthcare expenditures in this country. Mm-hmm. We're talking about billions. For the first time in the history of the world, this past year, we've passed the $2 trillion mark in healthcare. Now, you just think about that for a minute in terms of the political, economic, historical challenges that means. And it seems to me that in the context of what I started out to say in the beginning, namely our great challenge as a society, and certainly a great challenge for this university, is to begin to see its role in a global sense. The very nature of the healthcare expenditures in this country and the threat to the social fabric that it represents, I think, will impact significantly on our ability to function in a global sense.
Mm-hmm. So I want to kick in here, because when we talk about health, sometimes we only think about health in terms of the response to disease. But really throughout the history of human beings, health is often, the fundamentals of health have to do with nutrition, sanitation, and at some level education. And so I think we've got to link that concept of healthcare and the expenditures on healthcare with a much better and deeper understanding of health in the form of appropriate nutrition and appropriate lifestyle, which for many Americans are choices. But for much of the world, it's not yet a choice. And so my world is a rather large world in terms of its national boundaries. And I think about the concepts of markets, and I think about the ways in which my colleagues talk about power structures. But for me, it's much simpler. There are X people in the world. All of them need to eat every day, and somewhere, somehow, we have to produce that food so that the numbers of people that there are, the potential new markets that there are, and the potential competitors for our very own resources that there are in the world, we've got to figure out how we're going to produce not only the food, how we're going to distribute it, and how we're going to manage that natural resource in a sustainable manner. So I think about it at a much more maybe basic biological level. And for me, economic power in many, many parts of the world is so intimately associated with the ability to feed your people that if we don't talk about that and if we don't understand that what we call emerging markets, and we name China and India. China is the #1 producer of rice in the world. India is the #2 producer of rice in the world. The third largest producer of rice in the world is Indonesia, which is also the next largest country in terms of human beings. Anywhere you look, the largest collections of human beings in countries that are emerging as markets are also in places where agriculture is still the major driving force of their economies. And so I think that we all have sort of interrelated and interconnected concerns, issues, and opportunities here, one of them being to discuss technology in terms of technology, what is appropriate technology to address this question about food and water. And another aspect is how or to what extent is the future of the planet tied up with local food production, and to what extent is it going to be tied up with food that is produced in one area and transported at some tremendous cost in terms of energy to people elsewhere in the world. And I would just like to throw that out.
You and Ralph both have made the very strong case for a university that has a global responsibility and a global mission. And I wonder if we could just focus a little bit on your various views of the responsibility of the university. In our previous conversations, one of you asked whether the ivory tower is outmoded, whether there is no ivory tower left. Someone said it in a somewhat celebratory way. I believe that might have been Ralph. Let's talk about that, because I know you differ in your views. This might seem to be one of those questions where there would be wide agreement, general agreement, that knowledge transfer and the use of knowledge to solve some of these urgent problems we're discussing is the role of the university. But is it? And
I don't think we have a choice. We're already in it up to our heads. I mean, you all know we have a medical school in Qatar. We have medical teams in Tanzania and Haiti, around the world. So, I mean, the participation in a meaningful way with a good part of the third world goes on as we speak. And I think this university should take a significant amount of pride, at least that it has been a leader in some of this. And I think this is being done by many universities around the world. I think the issue of the technological arrogance that some of our previous speakers may have alluded to is a threat to how we implement some of the changes that occur. But let me give you an example. A couple of our students came back from Tanzania, and I asked them, and it was a transforming experience for some of them. And we talked about what you do when somebody came in with abdominal pain. You know, the concept of practicing medicine like it's the year 1500 rather than the 21st century is incredibly challenging. And you don't think in terms of CAT scans and sophisticated medications. You relate to the human being in the bed in a very primitive way. And the students and the people who experience this come back with very significant feelings of how they relate to the people under these circumstances. I think the university is a catalyst for the recognition that this shrunken world is one that we are an intimate part of, and that there's no way that we can shirk our responsibilities with respect to the transfer of knowledge and the implementation of knowledge.
Fred?
Well, I would certainly agree, Ralph, that we can't shirk that knowledge. And those of you on, shall we say, the other side of the campus certainly have more opportunities than we historians have to do it. I would, though, say, and I don't know if you would agree or not, Ralph, I would make a defense this afternoon, defense of the ivory tower. I would suggest that, in other words, I would argue for the importance of figuring things out over doing. And I think it could be harmful, perhaps even irreparably harmful, to be a little bit provocative here. If the university were to say to faculty, you have an obligation to go out and try to change that part of the world that your expertise speaks to. I'm not sure that many of us actually would be particularly good at it, although I'd like to hear what my colleagues have to say, because it seems to me practical wisdom doesn't always go with theoretical understanding. So I would say, and by the way, I'm not suggesting here that we should hole ourselves up in the ivory tower and never come out except to go over to Banffy's and have lunch and then go back in. I certainly believe that my fellow historians and I, for example, have to be sure that we're writing our books and articles not just for one another, which is a strong temptation and a strong tendency, but in fact to be writing books and articles for general readers, to connect with readers, both students and lay people, to be writing articles, to be giving talks. That's certainly important, but I would suggest, and I hope my fellow humanist Biddy would agree with me, that the humanities have a place, and in fact that the ivory tower is very important. There's a contemplative imperative, if I can put it that way, that I think the university provides and that is important.
I certainly agree with that.
Can I leap in here? So, I mean, I think as a computer scientist, my view is that certainly in my field, but I worry in the university at large, we really have to do both. We have to be deeply embedded in and working very closely with the world that we're all living in. We're really citizens of the world now, and that makes us a university of the world, and there's no way around that if we're going to be a first-rate university. But at the same time, we do have to be able to be contemplative and move beyond. And I think that puts incredible demands on us and on our students. I think one of the things that's really important for us when we're educating students these days is to help them be able to be contemplative at the same time that they're constantly busy. But we have the same challenge ourselves. We can't afford to only be contemplative. You can't teach somebody about how to be contemplative in the modern age if you have the luxury of being only contemplative. You need to be in the same hectic environment that they're living in and making the space to be able to contemplate. So, and I feel that pressure very strongly in computer science these days, because if you look at what's been accomplished as a field in computer science over the last two decades, it touches us every day. I mean, how many of you use a search engine many, many times? I mean, I sometimes feel like I can't turn around without looking something up on Google or Yahoo. And so that came out of fundamental research advances of the last couple decades, but at the same time, to do the next research, you have to be deeply embedded in that kind of hectic life that we're all living there. So
I was hoping to strenuously object to Fred, which would have made Biddy happy, but unfortunately he softened his position by the end. So in fact, let me pick up on what Dan had said. I think that is a very important element to the ivory tower, and having been in a policy-making world, I always recognized that it was crucial to go out there and get the views of people who are in the messy world of policy making about what the real questions are that are on their minds, what sort of challenges they're facing in their policy making. But then it's hugely important really to go back into the recluse of the ivory tower and think very hard about those problems before you re-emerge. And unfortunately, in academia, these two tracks very often end up getting separated, because in my own field, I know that there is much more of a reward to the deep contemplative thinking rather than writing down models which try to deal with the reality of policy making. But there is this other function as well which our contemplation leads us into, which is giving students modes of thinking, which is analytical models. And ultimately, that's what economics is all about. We can't really tell people how to solve every problem, but we give people a way of thinking. Now, it's a very rigorous, formalized way of thinking, but I think that is actually very useful in terms of abstracting from many of the practical realities of life, in terms of getting insights. But then again, unless these insights can be mapped into reality, they make no sense at all and are not really valuable. So I agree that we do need to have this back and forth, but finding that balance is really an enormously difficult challenge for all of us.
Of course, there are fields in which concepts are developed which can't be mapped readily onto the world, and the humanities is full of such work. I think it's not a contrast so much between the contemplative or the ivory tower on the one hand and contribution on the other. There's a contribution to be had in the work of conceptualization and the ability to develop that fine art as well as other arts, not only for our students, but in fields of study and fields of inquiry themselves. And that's what not only humanists, but all of us do. The relationship to an outside might be more mediated than it is if you're producing rice varieties that are actually going to produce food for people who don't have it. But both are valuable. Both are not only valuable, both are essential. I wonder if at this point we should open it up to some of you to see whether you have questions or comments for the panel. And while we're waiting for someone to go to a microphone, Ralph, you wanted to...
I just wanted to mention that the last thing we want to do is convey a pejorative theme to the ivory tower.
Right.
And let me just amplify that by quoting Lewis Thomas. I have the honor of holding the Lewis Thomas chair. Lewis Thomas was a truly Renaissance man, and at the end of his life, he was a professor at the medical school. And he pointed out the incredible correlation of the ivory tower with everyday life, and he pointed out three kinds of technology in medicine. The non-technology of caring, taking care of patients who have advanced disease, degenerative diseases, very costly, involving nursing homes and hospitals, etc. A very important part. The second kind of technology, the first being sort of a pseudo-technology, was what he called halfway technology. Ability to solve problems without really understanding what the fundamental etiology of a given situation is. Let me, for instance, renal dialysis, very expensive, bypass surgery, intensive care, very expensive tertiary and quaternary medicine, much of which we all know about and which has made a big impact on survival, but still far from the fundamental, what he calls high technology, where you get curative intent and curative possibilities such as immunization and antibiotics, etc. And it is from the ivory tower that these basic fundamental insights come. Basic science is an ivory tower endeavor. So the last thing we want to do is demean or in any way diminish that. All we're saying is it's part of a spectrum. Much of the future advance, certainly in medicine, will come from basic science, such as stem cells. Someone has pointed out that the treatment of diabetes now, which is an enormous problem in the Western world and throughout the whole world, involves halfway technology with enormous expenditures. Even though we can give people insulin, they all develop the end stages of ravages of diabetes. If you could cure diabetes with a stem cell transplant that would simulate a normal pancreas and replace a normal pancreas, you might cure the disease. And that kind of approach comes from a different way of thinking.
Thank you, Ralph. That was fabulous, a way to close that off. A questioner.
I want to talk about, let's say, not the Googleization of education, which I think is happening, but the question of the education at my age. I can seem to be get for nothing without paying tuition. I was rather shocked, surprised, and enlightened about a week or two ago, learning something I wasn't aware of, and that many well-known universities, MIT, Stanford, and others, their professors are giving free courses over the internet. So I looked up, I plugged in Stanford University, and I come up on the screen were a whole list of different courses and curriculum. So I clicked on astronomy, and all of a sudden I hear the professor of astronomy giving me a lecture with no cost, no tuition. This opened my mind, which is getting rather close at my age. So Biddy, this is the question for you.
Oh.
What is the impact of non-tuition, non-degree education on the globalization of education?
Well, it's a wonderful example you gave, and it's a great question, and I don't know the answer going forward. What I would say now is that these possibilities and opportunities for lifelong learning are extraordinary, and I think they will increase and will enhance the educations of everyone. In this country, on the other hand, I don't expect them to have a profound effect on residential college education, because I think it's so deeply embedded in the culture that part of what an undergraduate education is not just what one can get through online courses or even correspondence ones earlier, but really the experience of 4 years at a university with other students and in direct interaction with a faculty as great as the one we have. But Dan would be a good person to contradict me if he sees a trend of a sort that I don't see. I really don't see that.
Yeah, so what I would say, so open courseware is the MIT thing that started as an experiment. And I guess in the interest of full disclosure, I have to reveal in a room full of Cornellians that I have an MIT degree, sorry. But open courseware was the first of these large-scale experiments to put course materials online. And I think that it served as a very interesting experiment because it caused many of us who were looking at educational technology at that point in time to say, gee, this is going to help us understand the difference between what's the value of a college education versus the lectures. I mean, the textbooks have always been available, right? So the question starts to become, the textbooks used to be available. That still didn't replace a college degree. Now you can get the lectures online. Does that replace a college degree? I would say the answer is unequivocally no. And so the question starts to become, and I think it's an interesting one, where is the value of a residential college degree coming from? And I think a lot of it has to do with the kinds of interactions with faculty and with peers in a particularly focused and rather intense environment that's very different than what you get when you're sort of experience something remotely. It's, as Biddy said, it's sort of to expand on what she said a little bit, it's much more than just the factual material that you get out of a college degree. And one of the things that I think you've heard from several of us here sort of coming up in when we've mentioned teaching and students is that we think that it's very important to teach students certain critical ways of thinking. And I think that that comes from the interactions more than from the factual material itself.
Apart from open courseware, I would just say it is true, however, that that technology-assisted pedagogies, new pedagogies based on the development of technologies are influencing the way faculty teach and the way students learn at our university and at others in extremely interesting ways, but which don't really threaten, I think, the fundamental nature of or the need for undergraduate education. Yeah, Maureen?
I'm going to say that, you know, I think sometimes we also have to recognize that what we do at Cornell is not just residential. I teach in a program we have at the business school, the Cornell Queens program, where we're teaching executives an MBA program where the executives are spread all over Canada and the U.S. And I teach in a studio that we have in Sage Hall. And when I look up at my studio wall, I have screens from little boardroom groups all over. And so when I'm teaching, I pose a question that someone in Calgary decides they're going to answer, and they get into a disagreement with a group that's in Cincinnati and another group that's out in Portland. Now, as we use this, and then you say, well, what makes this residential? It's not. But for that moment, we are all residing together. And that's, I think, what's so great about this technology, because we can begin to use this technology to say, okay, I've brought together basically people from 2 different countries, and we're all arguing about the same problem, and we are all, at that moment, Cornell. So I think that's what's fun as we begin to go forward, and that's where this question's such a good one. What makes education? Is it just the lecture? Is it the book? Is it the venue? Or is it the process? And I think it's the process that makes education.
So can I dive in with one little thing on this? One quick thing, which is that I think that is a residential program. In the 21st century, that's residential. Because in the 21st century, residential doesn't mean in the same physical space anymore.
Yes.
Can I just say that perhaps
yes, sure.
An ideal test for this would be after you go back home tonight, ask one of your ex-Cornell friends to look up the webcast of this event and see if they had the same experience as you did today. And I think that will reveal a lot of difference.
Yes. Well, you go right ahead.
Invented by one of Dean Gatto's minions at Cornell.
The mic is walking to you.
While they've done a superb job, I still have difficulty walking around. I think you can hear me almost without this. I'm a producer, and I've learned how to project my voice. This is for Dr. Nachman, another one of our Cornell shining lights. You mentioned a figure about expenditure in health care. And in the light of all the discussion about health care in America today, that was a very, very impressive figure. Can you elaborate more on where that money goes, Dr. Nachman, and to what extent are we involved?
Well, we're all involved. The per capita expenditure in 2007 is estimated to be somewhere close to $7,000 a person. And with 300 million people in the United States, that brings us over $2 trillion. The percent expenditure that goes for drugs, I don't remember right off the top of my head, but it's like 12%, hospitals 15%, physicians 17%, et cetera. The issue is not the total amount, it's the recognition that the escalation is reaching a point where we are now at 16% of the gross domestic product. And I guess the question that the public has to answer, as well as the profession, is at what level does this expenditure become dangerous? And I put that word in quotes. A very famous medical economist who has since passed away, Eli Ginsberg, who was a professor at Columbia, once said, well, when we get to 15 or 16%, this was about 15 years ago, he said, we'll have to decide whether we want to go to 18 or 19%. And if we do, we'll have to interpret that in the sense that we spent 2 or 3% of our GDP on lipstick. In other words, we make social choices which reflect the culture. I may not have that right about lipstick. Maybe it's 1.5%. I don't know.
I think it's 0.8%.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe nail polish. Too.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think the $2 trillion represents a historic event in expenditures, and I think the challenge for us is, one, how to deal with it. I think it's very clear that there are major problems in the American healthcare system. I don't want to beat a drum that you're all familiar with, but there are 47 million people who are not covered by insurance. And we have to have the political will to deal with that, as well as change the expenditures that we now put out.
Yes.
You've all been very benignly one-worldish and politically correct here today, but my question is, in your heart of hearts, do any of you believe that the instantaneous globalization of education puts America at a serious competitive and economic disadvantage, in the sense that we can no longer compete on the basis of wages, and our only real competitive advantage has been our technological advantage? And if we give that away immediately to the rest of the world, doesn't that damage us? So I'd say, do any of you feel that way in your heart of hearts?
No.
Well, Susan McCooch is in the business of giving it away and has been giving away technologies as part of Cornell's land-grant mission forever.
I can address that in my own area very well, and that is that I would like to challenge anyone in this room to feed China. If we don't give our technology, or at least make our technology available to feed, so that the people who need to feed their populations can do so, then there will be a run on the available grain that other countries can produce. And our people will not be able to afford their standard of living, and their food prices will go through the roof. So I believe that we actually, not only morally, I think we have to share our technology, because we actually function as one global unit when it comes to the environment, food production, water, climate change. I think we have to start thinking more about being one world myself, but that's my opinion.
I wonder if Peter wants to be pessimistic.
Susan and I have become the best of friends, so, but of course he's wrong. So if you think about one worldism, I want to shrink that world just to America, because Ralph is talking about we have to make these choices. There is an invocation of a collective unity which has developed political will to address the issue of $2 trillion health care or $4 trillion or whatever. Well, actually what defines us is not the we, but the fighting amongst us. Call it red versus blue or whatever. What constitutes us is the good fight. That's what unites this panel of Cornellians. We hardly agree on anything. And so the notion of invoking will has an eerie resemblance to 19th century Hegel idealist philosophy. I don't see where this comes from. This comes from competition, from power, from moral imperatives. Just think about the moral imperatives. I would listen to the global university discourse here with interest. Yes, we can teach in different locales, in Cincinnati, in Cleveland, in Ithaca, and in New York. What is it that we teach? I can tell you, the one unifying pedagogy on this panel, which I found throughout Ithaca, is critical thinking. And the greatest challenge for our students is to get into their little heads the difference between information and knowledge. They're suffering from an oversupply of information. And yet the day only has 24 hours. That hasn't changed in a long time. How do you filter out irrelevant information? And this they don't know how to do. How do you get them to do it? By making them think critically and making them aware that there are lots of important moral choices. And Susan just spoke to one of them.
Much as it pains me to agree with Peter on anything, I think he's right about the critical thinking part, but I think there is another angle to this, which is getting students of ours and people in general to use the technology well. And going back to the example that Maureen talked about technology now binding international capital markets together. This is true not just of the advanced countries, but even India, for instance, has a very advanced infrastructure for trading stocks. Now, at one level, that's a very good thing. It makes markets, say, very deep. It allows for more efficient allocation of capital, but it does expose the economy to a lot of risks. So how do we think about training people who will eventually become policy makers, who will be able to use the technology well and be able to buffer the economy through good policies from bad things happening? So that's a very important part of this technology education combine as well.
I should say that we didn't really answer the question. No one actually came out and said, I'm worried about losing our competitive advantage. But I think the way Peter approached it is typical of the way scholars, intellectuals think about these questions, not exclusively from one side or the other. That is, not exclusively worried that we'll lose the competitive advantage, but also not worried.
Let me butt in for a minute,
well,
if I
okay.
may. But, you know, the competitive advantage technologically of the United States depends on, to a great extent, the immigration of the best minds from all over the world. Who are we kidding? Look at our university. Look at where people come from. The best minds are not necessarily the residents of a particular geographical or political entity. I think a world-class university recruits the best from anywhere. And it's an imperative that I feel very deeply. I don't know, you asked, is it in your heart of hearts? It's in the heart of my heart that we are, in fact, already not thinking about national boundaries in the same way, partly because of the technology, partly because the world has shrunk, partly because diseases travel, and partly because if you look at the dinner that you will eat tonight, what proportion of it is grown anywhere within a 50-mile radius? I mean, we are not actually living in a world, our markets aren't defined nationally, and I don't think we live in a world where old concepts of who is us and who is them apply anymore. And I think we need to update our thinking about this.
All right, I know you want to say something, but we better get to our audience and see if there are other questions. Bruce has been waiting for a long time.
Thank you, Biddy, and everyone. A great panel. My question's about communication. I understand all of the possibilities. I understand everything that you've talked about, whether it's stem cells or global markets or things like that. But I also understand that every one of those things in this world is subject to sound bites, to misinformation, to disinformation, and despite the fact that we talk about transparency in Google and finding anything out, you can't get on Google and find out a darn thing about the extent of the credit crisis in the world. So we shouldn't assume that information is out there, that it's true, and that it's adequate, and that it's accurate. You've seen whether it's stem cells, anything you've mentioned. How do you deal with that, and how should we be dealing with that? Thank you.
Dan, take that on. You wanted to speak.
All right. Well, to me, this actually gets to this one aspect of this critical thinking that we've been talking about, which is we have to teach ourselves and our students models of thinking that allow us to look at information that might be conflicting and be able to sort of sort through all of this different data and make an opinion that's informed. So I think that one thing about Google in the age of Google is that when you search, you see lots of opinions, often ones that are diametrically opposed to each other. And so the challenge today really is in sifting through information, it's sifting through information that is in conflict and trying to understand what the truth might be, or at least what your interpretation of the truth might be. So it's not that the opinions aren't there. I don't think you only get the misinformation. You get the misinformation together with correct information.
Fred.
I think it's a terrific question. And just to follow up on Dan, I think it's one of the reasons why I think the humanities, to come back to an earlier subject, and in my case, history in particular, has such great importance. I mean, because it's not a practical subject. I was going to say I'm proud to say, but I'll just say. History is not a practical subject. We don't try to impart information. This goes back to a point that Peter made. We don't try to impart information so much as to promote knowledge. And I think precisely in response to this question about communications, about sifting through what our politicians say, and whether we can trust what they say, the critical questions that we should be asking of policymakers and others, I think that the humanities has a particularly important role to play. And I think that one of the things that we aim to do is, in fact, to teach students, in my case through historical study, how to ask those kinds of questions. And the humanities, I won't say the humanities are uniquely in a position to do it, but certainly we have a very vital role to play at Cornell and in universities in general in getting students to think about the world in those terms. Again, it's not about information. It's about questions to ask. It's about knowledge. And that knowledge can turn into a certain kind of wisdom that I think goes to that question.
So I actually have a practical answer to that as well, which is that how many of you have used Wikipedia ever? Go on, admit it. Yeah, see a lot of hands go up. And most people who've used Wikipedia look at it as an encyclopedia. Next time you look up a piece of information there's a set of tabs across the top. One of them is a discussion about the article. It's called the article talk page. Go there and read the discussion. The discussion is often much more informative than the quote-unquote facts. And that's what I mean by critical thinking. It's understanding both positions or the variety of positions and not just trying to look at the isolated facts. So I think there's a practical sense in which that evil web can help you get there.
Yes.
Having graduated from Cornell, I believe that you all have taught me a little bit about critical thinking. And I've been thinking throughout this discussion today, which has been really wonderful, that Cornell is really about access, and it always has been, about access to education, about access to medicine, about access to food, about access to technology. And It seems to me that I remember when I went to Cornell, when I showed up there, it said on the crest, it had some words on there, and I believe it said, I would found an institution where any person could find instruction in any study. Is that correct?
That is correct.
It seems to be gone now, but
this is just the stylized version.
okay. If Cornell is really about access, what is Cornell going to do to improve access to the most important people that it needs to grant it to, and that is undergraduate students? Specifically, when is Cornell going to embrace no loan financial aid for students in order to allow access to Cornell, the greatest university on the planet, to the greatest students out there? When is that going to happen?
Well, thank you.
Gee, Biddy, that one's yours.
That could not be a better question or a more timely one. I agree with you completely about the urgency of it, and without saying anything that I really can't, I would only say that we will do more, and it will happen soon. Yeah, Phil, and then
We began the hour of this wonderful talk together with a question of whether Americans had some technological obsessions. I have a sense that there's a technological optimism. I'd like to strike a note of pessimism and suggest that globalization carries vast dangers that we've barely touched on tonight. And I'll identify two. One was touched on, and that is, of the 6.5 billion people on the planet, we're all vectors for potential new diseases. And secondly, barely a word has been said about global warming, two perhaps of the greatest threats for the next 50 years or foreseeable future. My question is to the entire panel, do you see us having the intellectual, not just at Cornell, but in the world, the intellectual capacities and resources to take on these problems, and how are we going to do it?
Well, unless we try, we're going to sink. There are very real threats. I mean, HIV, we all know and have lived through over the last several decades, but new and emerging viral diseases keep popping up, and our ability to communicate with our neighbors and to take care of people who develop foci of potentially dangerous infections. SARS is a perfect example. I mean, the world galvanized itself, Canada distinguished itself, and SARS became a epidemiologic artifact in a sense that it never spread beyond a very focal area. I think the SARS phenomenon, I think, is a beautiful example of what globalized approach to the threat of new emerging infections means.
It certainly seems true of global warming as well. While the risks come with globalization, the only opportunity to solve the problem is also global collaboration. So, Fred, you...
Well, that was essentially the point I was going to make.
So
I'm
I will
sorry.
defer,
Biddy.
Yeah,
You stole my thunder.
I'm sorry, I stole your thunder. I'm being told that we have to end. And I don't like taking orders, but I will. We were going to end by asking each panelist simply to answer the question, why Cornell? And so I'll give each of them just a very brief amount of time to answer that question. Fred?
Well, it's probably the case that Cornell is of particular importance to some people in the sciences, because the statement is often made that if you're a historian and if you're at a reasonably good university, you can be anywhere because you'll have your library, you'll have your resources, and you can do your work. However, for me, in my relatively short time at Cornell, it has been just a marvelous experience intellectually and in terms of what I've been able to do in my teaching, both of undergraduates and graduate students. And I think there are two quick things that I would mention. One is the interdisciplinary focus that we bring, certainly in the Arts College, which has given me an opportunity that I didn't have at my previous institution, which shall remain nameless, to engage with other humanists, to engage with people in the social sciences. I send my graduate students and my undergraduates to government classes, for example. Since I teach American foreign policy, it's a natural connection. But it's been so important to me that interdisciplinarity and have to give particularly my students that opportunity. And then one thing we haven't talked about tonight, which is, I think, probably more important to me and to Biddy than to anybody else, is the superb library that we have. And I don't know that it's often recognized just how good it is. And I've been to all of our competitors' libraries, and certainly in the kinds of things that I'm interested in, ours is right up there. And it's a great facility, needless to say, for those of us who are on the faculty, at least in the Arts College, and who use it a lot, but of course our students as well. So it's been a wonderful intellectual experience. And again, even as a humanist who I think could do my work in many different places, it's been special.
I'd like to pick up a theme that's been raised here by Fred and also come back to our technology, arguments that we've gone along. Years ago, it's been said that Microsoft was influenced by the statement, Cornell is wired, that we were ahead of the pack and all of a sudden they realized what the world looked like. I think for me, the reason why Cornell is because the whole university is wired. It's a great place to work. We really are very interconnected, and I think the business school is a good example. We're right in the middle of the university, and I think we're there for a reason, because we can't train people to do what they need to do. We cannot fulfill our mission as being a top graduate school of business if we aren't able to draw on all of the expertise of the university. And this is not the view taken by some of our more famous business schools who are happy to be on their side of the river. We're happy to be right in the middle. And the vision we have, not only for how we train our students, but the research that we do and the approach that we take, is that we need to recognize the greatness throughout the entire university, what we can draw on throughout all of it. And that, for me, is exactly why Cornell.
Why Cornell? Because while Cornell represents an opportunity and an institution which is facing the future with strength and vision, and it is part of a great university, and I'm happy to say after 4 decades at Weill Cornell, I'm beginning to see a very meaningful attempt that is now bringing real results of trying to shrink the 230 miles or so that exist between Ithaca and New York. And I think as this distance shrinks, just the way the world has shrunk, I think the strength and the power of the biomedical sciences and the synergies that exist on both campuses will bring distinction to the institutions and, most importantly, help us deal with one of the great problems of the 21st century, health and human disease.
So I would say, for me, it's first and foremost our students. In fact, largely our undergraduates. The kinds of students like the ones who were on the DARPA Urban Challenge team that Biddy mentioned I was one of the faculty co-advisors of, who came into my office with the tenacity to say, we're going to put together a vehicle that's going to beat everybody else out there, and wouldn't take no for an answer, just sort of, I probably spent 20 hours a week for an entire year working on this project, not having planned to do it, and on top of everything else. And so the kinds of students who have the enthusiasm and tenacity to drag you into the impossible, I think that's first and foremost. And I would say, secondly, the colleagues. I mean, I really think, there's a lot of talk about interdisciplinarity in universities these days, and I think Cornell really has it in a fundamental way. I'm part of a team that's sociologists and economists and computer scientists and people in the business school working on social networks. That could only happen at Cornell, and I call it the Wegmans effect, right? We all see each other in the produce section. That's the thing about Ithaca.
Globalization is never going to work if all it benefits are the Americas of the world or the other industrial countries of the world. When I first came to Cornell, I knew very little about Cornell other than it's a great university with great people. And when I took off my bureaucratic hat and put on my professorial cardigan, I was terrified that I'd lose access to important policymakers in countries like China and India. It turns out, and this is something I'm beginning to realize more and more, that Cornell has very deep tentacles across the emerging market, and these are very benign tentacles. The work that Susan and my colleague Chris Barrett have been doing in various parts of the world, looking at food aid and so on, work we've been doing in terms of developing agricultural products, work we've been doing in terms of improving economic knowledge in these countries, has really given us a wonderful base to get back to one of the themes I talked about, which is bringing together academics and policymakers and trying to solve these problems together. And this issue of students is really at the core, I think, of our mission and where Cornell can really deliver, because by training people who I think are going to be ambitious enough to become policymakers or people who seriously influence the internal debates within these countries, I think in addition to the economic prerogatives that are required to solve some problems, as Peter mentioned, the political will is crucial as well. And I think at Cornell, we can really accomplish a lot in terms of the broader global context by teaching students who will go out and in some sense do the right thing.
So I came to Cornell after being in the Philippines for 5 years at the International Rice Research Institute, and I wanted to do the same work that I'd been doing in the Philippines. And it was absurd, right? Why would a rice breeder leave the Philippines and come to Ithaca, New York? I mean, there was no rationale for that at all, except that I happened to be married to a veterinarian who had a practice in upstate New York. So I think it's a testament to Cornell that after a period of time, one has to earn one's stripes, of course. I was able to join the faculty and continue my international rice genetics and breeding program and do it almost as effectively, sometimes I think more effectively, from Cornell than I was doing at Erie, remaining just as connected as I had been, and perhaps much in a way more connected, because it was easier to be connected for all the reasons we've talked about today. And so I feel, and the way I think about it is, if you have to look around the world, if you had unlimited choices, but you know what you want to do, the reason you're going to choose an institution is because it empowers you and because it allows you to empower others. And for me, that's what Cornell is all about. It empowers our students, it empowers our faculty, our staff, and I want to say that it's a wonderful institution in the way that the administration allows it to be governed from the bottom up. And that for me is really important. So I hope that people who are affiliated with Cornell and continue to be, as many of you in this room must be or you wouldn't be here, realize that actually Cornell is not a resident experience. It is all of us all over the place who continue to see it as a form of empowerment. Thanks.
Well, I think my colleague has spoken very eloquently about Cornell and why Cornell, and I think I can't add anything to it. But in one way or another, we all got on a bus to come here. And I think that's the metaphor for the world as I see it, a world of distant proximities. And that's the relationship between Ithaca and the world. I don't think the world is just shrinking. It remains distant. And yet it is one world. And I think Ithaca is a very good place from which to engage that world.
I want to thank all of you for coming and thank the panelists. And in response to the question, why Cornell, I would say because of people like this, our students, because it's intellectually rigorous beyond compare, unpretentious, and it works.